Welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government and to this event, which is organized by the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. It's fantastic to see so many of you in the room and also online. We had about 500 people registered for this event online, and it's great to have you join us this evening. This evening, we are here to launch the publication of this book by Dr. Hugo Slim. The book, as you know, is titled Solferino 21, Warfare, Civilians, and Humanitarians in the 21st Century. And Hugo Slim, who is next to me, Senior Research Fellow here in Oxford at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, and also now at Blackfriars College, who has devoted the last, shall we say, 2 years or thereabouts of his life to producing this work, which is a reflection on the state of warfare, the position of civilians, and humanitarian action in the 21st century. When Hugo started writing this book and he said it was going to be called Solferino 21, I thought he meant 2021. And I thought, but it's published in 2022. What are we going to do? But the 21 is a reference, I think, to the 21st century rather than 2021. Today, I'm sure you will have all sort of woken up to the news, you know, the main thing that's been in the news all day, Russia, Ukraine, and actually over the last couple of weeks or thereabouts, a lot of us, I'm sure, would have been wondering, you know, we're on edge as to what's going to happen. And in many senses as to the sort of the future of the world. So it's a bit of an auspicious day to be launching this book, because Hugo's reflections on the state of war actually in a very prescient manner, he talks about what we're seeing happen today, as in literally today, the return of great power conflict. And he speculates as to, you know, where that's going to take us. One of the things we see, Russia, Ukraine today, we see cyber conflict, and we're starting to think about the role of technology in modern day warfare. This is another theme that Hugo reflects on in his book. So it's really, you know, very often when you do these kinds of introductions, you say the topic is important, and you say, we have no better speaker to talk to us about this important topic than the person who's speaking to us today. Well, I think I don't really need to say that the topic is important. You know, today we can see that the topic really is important. And the themes that Hugo reflects on are themes that we will be talking about for a while. So all I'm going to do is really introduce Hugo, introduce the two people who are going to be commenting on the book, and then hand the floor over to them. And then we'll return to you as we have saved some time for question and answer after they have spoken. So Hugo Slim, I have already talked about a little bit, but just to say a bit more about his career. Hugo has spent his career essentially reflecting on the ethics of war, humanitarian aid and humanitarian action. And he's done that in various guises, really. He's been in and out of academia. He's back in academia, and we're grateful to have him back in academia. But he's also, if you like, got his hands dirty. I dislike the expression being in the real world, but to some people that's meaningful. And so maybe you want to say Hugo's been in the real world. He's literally got his hands dirty working with humanitarian organizations at various levels. Save the Children, he's been on the board of Oxfam, he's worked with the UN, and most recently, he spent 5 years as head of policy and humanitarian diplomacy at the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva. We're really grateful to have had him back as a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. That was the position he held before he went to the ICRC. And he came back to us to work on this book. And after Hugo spends 15, 20 minutes talking about the book, we have two amazing commentators on the book who will be reflecting on several themes. We have with us in person here Professor David Whetham, who is Professor of Ethics and the Military Profession at King's College London. He has also actually reflected on these issues in various guises. I think David and I first met in the context of the work that he has been doing for the National Defence Academy here in the UK, training hundreds, if not thousands, of military officers from around the world on issues to do with military ethics. And we have with us, unfortunately not in person, but online, you see her behind us, we have Sorcha O'Callaghan, who is director of the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. ODI, you might know, is a global think tank on working on issues of development and sort of injustice. I'll come back to David and to Sorcha after I hand the floor over to Hugo. So Hugo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dapo. And thank you, all of you in the room, for coming. And thank also to the many, apparently hundreds, which is incredible, of people who are registered online. Thank you very much for joining us. It's very kind of you to do so today. Before I talk about the book, I want to give a few other thanks as well, because a book is always a joint effort. So first of all, a big thank you to the 4 organizations who funded my work on this for just over a year: the International Committee of the Red Cross, the British Red Cross, the German Red Cross, and the Norwegian Red Cross. And I couldn't have done it without them, and we must thank them for that. And also to Dapo and the team at ELAC. This is now the 2nd book I've written at ELAC, and every time I come back, they've got even better offices. So it's incredibly glamorous this time at the Blavatnik School, and many thanks to the Blavatnik School people as well. I want to thank Nicholas Barker and Moshe Ben Hamo-Yeager, who were my 2 really brilliant research assistants, and Nick is here with us today, and Moshe's in Mexico. A special thanks to the Italian Red Cross, who were really kind and showed me around Solferino in Italy for 3 days when I'd finished the book. I was meant to start the book in Solferino, but of course COVID stopped all that, but I did get there in the end. And so the epilogue reflects my encounter with Solferino. I want to thank Hearst, my publisher, who are a delightful publisher to work with. I recommend them strongly if you've got a book in you. And finally, a big thank you to Sorcha and to David, who I forced to read the book, poor things, and thank you for doing it and giving your time. So, what is it all about? In 1862, Henri Dunant published this book, A Memory of Solferino, telling the story of his few days around the Battle of Solferino, nursing and caring for wounded soldiers. And this was after a huge battle of 300,000 people, of which about 25,000 were killed or missing within the 14 hours of the battle, and probably easily another 30,000 wounded. And it was a major operation. And in this little book, Dunant, after his experience, he reflected on the battle. So the first part's on the battlefield. The second part's on the humanitarian response as it emerged around Italian villages, really led mostly by hundreds of Italian women. And he reflects on that, and he makes 3 policy calls. And it's a phenomenal book because he achieved all those policy calls within 2 years. He called for a network of national relief societies. He called for an international relief society to support them. And he called for an international law to protect the wounded in war. And 2 years after this book was published, all 3 had happened. We had the beginning of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. We had the creation of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we had the First Geneva Convention to protect the wounded in war. So we have those 3 things today because of Dunant, and we still have war. And even, as Dapo said, a new war this morning. 160 years later, the purpose of the second book, this one, Solferino 21, is to look at war and humanitarian response today in light of Dunant's original vision, and to review the big changes that have happened over that time, and to look 10 years ahead. So that's what I try and do in this much fatter book. I suppose if you get an academic to write a book, it's bound to be bigger than if you get an activist to write a book. So that's the trouble. Anyway, it's not as big as it looks. So in a sense, we're taking stock of a new Solferino moment of the 21st century, and to think about how humanitarians need to adapt to it. And this book's in 3 parts. It's about warfare, civilians, and humanitarians. And I'm just going to try and nip through it for you. So warfare. The book starts by looking at 21st century warfare so far. And my first point is that so far this century, war is militarily small. There have been no great armies, navies, air force, clashing over continents and oceans. And battles have been small, with nothing approaching the scale even of the Battle of Solferino. And the closest is probably the Battle of Mosul. Combatant and civilian casualties have been much lower than the 20th century. And this is very good news. And we need to make it last. I then describe other things we all know about war in the 21 years of this century so far, that it's often very long, it's often urban, it's largely asymmetric, insurgency and counterinsurgency warfare. It's often fought out as internationalized civil wars with coalitions of states and armed groups fighting other coalitions. An early 21st century is also hyper-legal when operated by Western forces and Western publics and electorates. War in the last 20 years has been saturated with hundreds of legal regulations and with battalions of military, humanitarian, and human rights lawyers. I also point out, drawing on the work of the great Keith Krause and Cleona Drali, that political violence of many other kinds and criminal violence are actually more pervasive and kill more people every year than war in the strict sense. But there is military novelty as well in the 21st century so far, and that is we are entering the age of computerized warfare, cyber warfare, and wide public participation in the personal information space of warfare. So my main point in the opening in the first bit of the book is that warfare is at a tipping point, just as it was in the time of Dunant, and we are at a new Solferino moment. So just as Dunant and Solferino stood at the tipping point of traditional warfare and industrial warfare that was about to take to major artillery, take to the air, massive industrial scale bombardments and trenches and millions of people in armies. Just as Dunant was at the tipping point of that change, we are at the tipping point of computerized warfare and big warfare that is coming towards us, not militarily small warfare, but what I call big war, potentially huge peer-to-peer clashes with 3 new domains, not just land, sea, and air of industrial warfare, but outer space, cyberspace, and personal information space. So I look at this multi-domain warfare and its potential struggle for planetary advantage. The fight is no longer about a continent, a country, or whatever. Potentially, it's about the planet. And here I land on the major challenge posed to military and humanitarian ethics of AI-based warfare, the question of keeping human control and human authenticity in artificially intelligent weapons, and the operational challenges of machine judgment and machine responsibility in computerized warfare. And just a word on human control. I do not idealize or romanticize this principle of human control over weapons, because in truth, much human control in warfare has been truly terrible. It's not only machines that can create dystopia from war. Humans have consistently used warfare to create dystopias in history for millions of people. So the greater goal, in my view, therefore, is not necessarily human control, but humanitarian control. And this may be found in machine control as well as human control. We'll see, and we must work for that. Finally, on warfare, I make a point about climate change. I think that extreme climate will shift from being a condition of warfare, a condition in which it's difficult to fight in deserts, ice, whatever, and move from being a condition of warfare to becoming a cause of warfare that is existentially pressing as some of the world becomes unlivable and other areas, like the Arctic, are revalued as climate strategic. So that's war and warfare. If we move to the second part now on civilians, it's striking, of course, when you read Dunant's account in his great book. Dunant never really mentions civilian suffering at all. He sees only wounded male bodies. But today, it is the civilian that stands in the center of the humanitarian framing we put around warfare. And not just the civilian, but the civilian woman and girl. So the second, big point about the book is, and it's an obvious one, the last 160 years has seen a complete gender reversal in the iconic victim of war, from the wounded soldier to the female civilian. So the second section of the book looks at what we know about civilian suffering and survival in war today. And here, in comparison with the previous centuries, there is also good news. The militarily small wars of our century so far mean that the number of civilian violent deaths, battle deaths, is greatly reduced. And in most wars, there are more combatants violently killed than civilians. Syria is probably the worst war of our century so far. Best estimates suggest that in its first 10 years, 594,000 people were violently killed. And I understand that this is so many precious people. But I had to look at numbers and make comparisons. And out of these 594,000 people killed in the Syrian war, some 467,000 were combatants, and a much smaller number of 117,388 were civilians. And out of these civilians in Syria, the majority, 69%, were men. And these figures go against our popular humanitarian imagination today that has, I think, come to assume that most people violently killed in war are civilians and probably women. But they're not in Syria and in many other wars. And this leads to the main point of my civilian section, really, that most people experience war as poverty, not violent battle. For many millions of people, war is primarily a socio-economic disaster, a terrible displacement and deep impoverishment. I illustrate this with something I call the death displacement ratio, the number of people violently killed to the number of people displaced. And for example, if we look at the Yemen conflict, for every one person, one civilian violently killed, there are 333 forced into displacement and poverty. And in Nigeria, for every one person, one civilian violently killed, there are 160 that flee into displacement and poverty. And that's why we get this massive unplanned urbanization all over the world because of war and displacement. And of course, wartime poverty obviously leads to increased death. And here, Professor Paul Wise's general rule holds that war's destruction of essentials, businesses, homes, public services, usually creates excess mortality that doubles the death from violence. So as we know, most civilians die from war, not in battle. But this ratio may well change in big war if legal calculations of military necessity and proportionality change in the face of existential threats between great powers or from climate change. If that's the case, then in big war, we can probably expect massive numbers of combatant and civilian deaths again. Unless human nature and human political culture is genuinely changing in this century, and AI proves more humanitarian than we are. Two other points are important about civilians. First, we've seen exponential and ethically essential change in the appreciation and valuation of women and girls' experience of war. Humanitarian aid over my lifetime has seen a very important gendering. But this important moral correction runs two risks, as many feminist scholars have observed. And the first is that men have become the invisible civilians in today's war. And the second is that women's experience of war is being stereotyped as fragile and weak, when in fact they are frequently leading wartime survival and recovery and change. Another thing is that many civilians today live as digital civilians, and the virtual lives of civilians will be a major part of warfare and humanitarian aid in the next 10 years. And it already is. So many humanitarian agencies deal almost entirely virtually with civilians these days. And civilians are often attacked through virtual digital channels too. And finally, I focus on the importance of recognizing civilian agency alongside humanitarian agency. It is civilians who do most of the survival and recovery in wartime. Humanitarians can only ever help some of the people, some of the time, and in some ways. And so the art of humanitarian aid must be to work with and empower civilians and not hedge them in with complicated systems of aid. And I'm seeing some Oxfam faces in this room, and Oxfam have really worked incredibly hard to pioneer the idea of supporting civilian agency and helping civilians survive in what they're doing already. So, the third part of the book is on humanitarians. And this bit, in the sense, is about us, all the humanitarian agencies, my profession. And it tells the story of enormous humanitarian progress that has happened since Dunant's book. It's the story of the largely Western system of humanitarian aid as it has grown in UN, Red Cross, Red Crescent, and INGO, international NGO organizations. It's the story of their humanitarian aid and their discoveries. And I illustrate this progress by comparing the suffering of civilians in Syria in 1916 and 2016, that 100-year period. In 1916, there was no organized humanitarian system to reach out and meet the hundreds of thousands of civilians who were being forcibly displaced, destituted, and killed. And as a result, hundreds of thousands died. In 2016, that wasn't the case. The same sort of terrible battle displacement, very similar in parts, but all those millions of people walked towards a humanitarian system of norms, operational agencies, and many of them, most of them, survived, are still alive, are having families in different ways. Their life is not ideal, but they are not dead. The last 160 years is a story also of humanitarian achievement, with millions of lives saved and assisted, therefore. And I firmly believe that humanitarian aid is one of the great moral and practical achievements of international collective action in the last 160 years. Dunant was one of its founders, and the ancestors of today's humanitarian aid are equally other people. And I have a soft spot for the great Herbert Hoover, later to be American president, who in my view was probably the greatest Western humanitarian of all time and saved more lives in bigger operations than any other individual. His way of doing aid at an industrial scale has influenced the aid of today. And sitting in Oxford, so has Eglantine Jebb, who founded Save the Children, and our own Oxfam in Oxford. And there's been profound influences on humanitarian aid from Asia to the great Amartya Sen changed the way humanitarians think about famine. The great Muhammad Yunus changed the way we think about cash and civilian agency. Dunant's neutral Swiss model is also only one humanitarian tradition if we look back at the last 160 years. Many resistance movements like the anti-apartheid movement, liberation theologians in Central and South America, have also generated an important tradition which I call resistance humanitarianism. And the first 20 years of our century have seen significant humanitarian elaboration in 5 main areas, which often make humanitarian aid much more today like pro-poor community development than its previous manifestations. One of the most fundamental changes has been to the foundational principle of humanity itself. This principle of humanity has almost been revolutionized in the last 20 years from a simple meta category for all human beings having something in common to a notion of diverse humanity, which in the spirit of our liberal age breaks out a wide range of different and intersecting micro identities that humanitarians now try to work with in great detail, and this naturally complicates aid. Other elaborations include a widening humanitarian field so that new fields like protection, education, mental health, climate adaptation, and big time today's social protection schemes are now part of the humanitarian project. And humanitarians, importantly, have also extended their time horizon and now routinely operate what I call long aid. And this sees them working with the same communities for decades, like UNRWA across the Middle East. And I look at aid today and wonder if everyone isn't becoming like UNRWA in many of these long conflicts. All this amounts to a new ambition towards a form of global welfare that is more in keeping with the 19th century use of the word humanitarian than its narrowed emergency meaning of the late 20th century. It also leaves a strategic problem around humanitarian purpose for a sector that is deliberately trying to do everything. And my last chapter is about the need for humanitarian change. And this is difficult because I must criticize something I'm a part of, which I've been encouraging for 40 years as a teacher, writer, and occasional humanitarian worker. And my main point in this chapter, it's not particularly new, and it is, I argue that the so-called international humanitarian system is in fact a parochial and plurilateral Western system, which has a strong imperial flavor with its humanitarian elites living colonial lifestyles. International elites have regulatory and financial capture of this humanitarian system because they pay for it. But 98% of the people who manage and operate the daily work and are the world's majority humanitarians are actually from communities within these walls. And my point is that aid is too international today in an array of super agencies that would shock Dunant's commitment to national networks. I see the challenge, therefore, as the obligation of these international agencies to respect people's right to self-determination And I argue for humanitarian self-determination, much greater investment in national humanitarian institutions and organizations that are locally led. And you can look at me and you can see I'm not obviously a complete revolutionary. I do not demand a year zero of localization like some people do. But the right balance of humanitarian aid must be that it is locally led and internationally supported, not the other way around. And this is for practical reasons too. The extent of the climate crisis coming at us and any big war that comes at us will mean that Western-backed super agencies, super bureaucracies, if you like, cannot do it all. National organizations will be essential and will reach more widely. And the goal there should be, therefore, should be a system of systems across the world. Chinese humanitarian system, Indian, African, Islamic, Christian, Buddhist, Russian, and not the globalization of the Western system, which will always be rejected in large parts of the world. So that's more or less the book. I'm sorry it took a bit of time to summarize, but you don't have to read it now. I mean, look on the bright side. So I urge probably 4 things at the end: that humanitarians should prepare for big multi-domain warfare in an era of climate crisis. That is the reality they need to prepare for. That humanitarians should stay focused on all civilians and support them with simpler, enabling aid. And that humanitarians should recognize neutral humanitarianism and resistance humanitarianism. Because even if we look at Myanmar and potentially Ukraine today, a lot of humanitarian action will be led by and within resistance movements. And finally, that they should move fast to invest in locally led humanitarian networks. Thank you all very much, and I hope you all find some value in Solferino 21.
Thank you very much, Hugo. I can't quite resist a comment that I made to Hugo privately at the start. He was comparing the book by Dunant with his own. And I said, this is a Slim volume, and this is a volume by Slim. Hugo mentioned that we're all digital civilians. And I also omitted at the start to note that we're all, well, many of us, social media civilians. So we do have a hashtag for the event this evening, and the hashtag, for those of you on social media, it's hashtag Solferino21. So please do use that. The other thing that I should have said at the start is that copies of the book are available, and you can buy them from the Hearst website for a discount with the code Solferino. So I'm sure you'll all be rushing to get your own copy. But after hearing Hugo introduce the book, we're now going to turn to our 2 commentators. We're going to start with Sorcha O'Callaghan, who is online with us. As I said earlier on, Sorcha is the director of the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. And in that context, she's been leading their research into humanitarian system reform, one of the things Hugo talked about, inclusion, gender, displacement, which Hugo also mentioned. And she will be commenting on the book, I suppose, from a humanitarian perspective. So over to you, Sorcha.
Thank you, Dapo, and a huge thank you to you, Hugo, because it was such a pleasure and a privilege to both read the book and to also be part of the launch of what I found to be a really compelling, a compassionate, and a hugely comprehensive book. And maybe first a couple of overall reflections. So, I thought the examination of the 150 years since the Battle of Solferino, and in particular this kind of triple lens of warfare, civilians, and humanitarian action, hugely compelling. And it reflects very much the concerns of IHL, but I think too often warfare is part of a backdrop of humanitarian action. And we often don't hone into warfare in the level of depth that you have. and understand the changing character of war, the implications for civilians and what that might mean for our actions today. So I found this framing tremendously helpful and broadening in terms of my perspectives. In many places, it was a difficult read. I thought the comparison of civilian deaths, challenging to read through, and just the examples that you provided, but also, I think how you portrayed civilians throughout, their agency, their experiences of war. There's so much to the forefront of this book that it did feel like, although you were dealing with difficult topics, that it was a hugely compassionate read. And last, it might be larger than Dunant's book, but it's hugely comprehensive. You packed so much in, there's so much to learn. And so I would really urge anyone coming from an anthropological point of view, a war or military point of view, and in particular a humanitarian perspective to read it. I wanted to pull out 3 threads. First of all, the extent and representation of civilian suffering. Second, the idea of humanitarian stretch. And last, the shifts and the call away from Western models of humanitarian action. So first, on the representation of civilian suffering. You provide a really fascinating account of civilian experience in war, but also I think you place a lot of emphasis on the degree to which there's a humanitarian hype, as you call it, around kind of civilian suffering and resilience. And I think you really rightly take issue with lazy humanitarian claims that civilians today are suffering more than ever before, and you debunk everything from the fact that most deaths in conflict are civilian, that women and children suffer most, that there are record high levels of displacement, and also that there are even conflict-affected countries rather than localized regions. And I fully agree with this, and that humanitarians play a large role in inflating and misrepresenting civilian suffering for their own purposes, and that they center their own saviorism and underplay civilian action and action of other actors in a way that's highly problematic. But I also wanted to think about this representation of the civilian a little bit more. And while I feel that humanitarians certainly manipulate and misrepresent for their own purposes, I do think that the notion of a civilian is one that is highly, I guess, instrumentalized by a wider set of actors, and that this is really problematic in terms of representation of who is deserving of humanitarian attention. And so I think the very notion of who is a civilian is one that is in particular very politically determined. And we saw that, for instance, during the Cold War, where despite the high levels of suffering within countries, that humanitarians, and particularly those funded by European and North American donors, focused almost entirely on the suffering of refugees who had fled these countries rather than those within. And this was because neutral civilians suffering oppressive communist regimes were very politically useful to Western powers. But at that time, that kind of representation and that manipulation of who was deserving of humanitarian attention really constructed the humanitarian endeavor. And so this sense and representation of who is civilian, who is deserving, has, has huge ramifications for how the humanitarian model and humanitarian priority is determined. And we could see this right up to the 1980s in the US, where refugees were actually considered victims of persecuting fleeing communist-dominated countries. That was a definition that continued right up to the 1980s. And it was only after the Cold War that actually humanitarians went more into conflict to assist civilians in conflict, because then issues around containment of civilians in these conflict-affected regions became much more a political objective. And we see this tension today in the context of counterterrorism, where entire groups and regions are deemed not to be deserving of humanitarian attention. So I wanted to press you on this a little bit more to see about this kind of issue of the representation of civilian suffering and the degree to which this actually informs a sense of who is deserving of humanitarian attention, and agree that humanitarians play a really problematic role in that, but whether there's a wider issue at play here. And the second question in relation to this is, having peddled this saviorism role with donor publics, where humanitarians are overemphasizing their role and underestimating that of civilians and other actors, how can we transform this engagement and this representation without losing public solidarity with causes very far from doorsteps? So that was my first thread. The second issue that really captured my attention is this issue of humanitarian stretch and your call for a simpler form of humanitarian aid. And I think you give a really articulate and powerful overview about how civilian roles have been better understood over the years towards an understanding that's greatly more contextualized, more gendered, and where civilian agency is better represented. And alongside this, you paint an important analysis of both humanitarian progress, which you described in your overview, but also humanitarian stretch. And you argue that it's important that humanitarians remember and rediscover their main purpose and find a simpler way of going around their business. And I find this search for simplicity compelling, but I do wonder also to what degree the increased ambition or perhaps sophistication of humanitarian aid actually reflects a greater recognition of what's required to save the very varied and complex lives that civilians have always led. And while I very much recognize the increased bureaucratization of aid that you describe and often suffer immensely from it, I do wonder whether this is more of a headquarters phenomenon, because what we're seeing in our research within HPG is that, while there is important work to understand better the experience of civilians in crisis, we are still finding that humanitarians are very much preoccupied with reaching the most people in need, rather than ensuring that they're providing quality support and the right types of support for people who are most in need. And so this means that still, within responses, the differentiated impact of violence on different groups, whether it's men, as you rightly highlight, are now almost invisible, the elderly, those with disabilities or beyond, are often frequently left out of adequate support. And so I do wonder whether, in our quest to go back to a simpler form of aid, we risk a disengagement with the increased complexity associated with saving the very varied lives of civilians in the urban, protracted, digital, and other conflicts that you describe. And that, irrespective of whether it's a national, local, or international actor providing assistance, whether what we should be aiming for is not just a simpler form of aid, but an aid that is most focused on those most acutely in need and understanding the very differentiated needs that they experience. The last thread I wanted to pick up was around Western models of humanitarian action, and you rightly take aim at the Western Club, describing a phenomenon of super agencies that are set on a path of building bigger footprints. And you say that this is, it doesn't cut it. It's limited in its access, it's colonial in its practice, and centered in expensive bureaucracies. And you paint a very articulate and persuasive argument for moving beyond current principles of local humanitarian action towards a model that prioritizes national and local aid with international support. And I find this argument very persuasive. It very much chimes with long-standing work we've been doing on local humanitarian action. But I'm puzzling, and I think many of us are puzzling, as to how to actually, what it will take to make this shift to local, national, regional forms of humanitarian assistance with international systems of solidarity. And I wondered whether you think it's about kind of working around the current system, recognizing that there is actually a huge amount of dynamism and activity happening amongst local and national actors that's under-recognized and under-supported. So is it about, I guess, supporting a systems of systems, or whether it is about transforming the core, the current traditional system? And I found your focus has been very much about changing the current response model. But I do wonder, whether that is possible, whether the right incentives are in place to make this transformation. So a little bit of a question there about how we should make this happen, whether it is about transforming the core or whether it is about supporting alternative models. So I'll stop there, but huge congratulations, Hugo. I really enjoyed reading with the book and engaging with the very many different threads. I just picked up 3, but I could have picked up 100 more. So I hope that this book has the readership and the impact it deserves.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Sorcha. Just to say, especially for those of you who are online, the questions are already pouring in. So please do continue to use the Q&A function and to post your questions, and we'll come to them after we hear from David Whetham. So David, over to you. Thank you. Have a sneak peek. Questions coming in. 13 already.
13. So, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in Oxford this evening, and it's even a greater pleasure to be able to talk about Hugo's new book. I'm going to focus on the first half of it, as the later chapters have been exceptionally well covered by the last speaker. Now, Hugo's book's opening chapter starts with an attempt to define terms, as all good academic projects do. Now, this wasn't something that Henri Dunant was particularly worried about. Everybody knew what war was. War's war, right? Of course, it's not so simple now, and I don't think it was actually that simple then. Hugo starts off with some legal definitions. He gives us international armed conflict, non-international armed conflict, before moving into the political definitions and the descriptions from agonistic and asymmetric conflict through to hegemonic contests, all demonstrating the broad range and types of conflict or armed competition along the spectrum of what is so easily covered by this label war, which everybody appears to know what it means until you really start trying to define it. The chapter then takes us through a typology of the characteristics of different warfare that we've seen so far in the 21st century. Any students of war or conflict will find each area well considered, pertinent, and well explained, with a commendable brevity, as has already been commented upon. These are complex issues, and although it is a very large book, it is beautifully written and covers a huge amount of ground without feeling that it is doing so in a shallow way. From the role of technology in the current conflicts through to the type of chronic political violence that claims many lives, but somehow isn't regarded as falling into the usual definition of war, even though Karl von Clausewitz would certainly recognize it as such in that category. So over that 160 years, the changes in the experience of war, what does that look like? In the ICRC advisory group note in the very introduction, and as Hugo has already said, civilians are now at the center rather than the combatant. I think this is the area that I had the biggest challenge with. not with the majority of this argument, but with the idea that, that the centrality of war was not aimed at squarely at civilians historically. Hugo notes on page 6 that we need reminding that wars of the 20th century were certainly not unprecedented in their horror. And we could go back to antiquity and consider the sack of Troy. Now, we all know what happens at Troy. We all know the story of Troy, but where's the account of the death and destruction of the civilian population within that city afterwards? The sack of Limoges is an example from the 100 Years' War. The chronicles of the 100 Years' War are not interested in the suffering of the civilian population. That's just not what the audience is interested in. Froissart and the other chroniclers are writing for an audience who wants to know about the details of battle. They want to know about knights. They don't want to know about the tens of thousands of innocent victims of the war. Neither were the chroniclers of antiquity concerned with this. But to take one example from medieval warfare, the chevauchée. The chevauchée, which is often mistranslated as a raid. It's not a raid, it's a procession. It's a procession of armed people spread out over a wide area, doing as much damage to people and property as possible in a bid to force the opponent to the negotiating table. Now, the fact that at this time, the civilians on the land were simply regarded as another movable property explains in part why that is not the focus of these accounts. The 30 Years' War resulted in the Treaty of Westphalia, which established the international architecture that international relations still is very familiar with us today. But that one conflict, that 30 Years' War, claimed somewhere between 4 and 12 million lives, while only 450,000 of those are thought to have died in actual combat. Disease and famine counted for the lion's share of the others. So as far as suffering is concerned, it's not that civilians have not been at the center of war or even been the instruments of war, but there is a change in perception because now we care. That's probably the biggest difference. Hugo notes in his introduction, the term civilian only actually emerged in the 20th century, but now we see their suffering as well in a way that was perhaps just simply not the case before. And seeing this war, seeing conflict through different lenses is an important theme of this work. And for me, perception is a theme that emerges very strongly here. So from the tactics that might be deliberately aimed at drawing the foul, to take a basketball analogy, drawing the foul where you deliberately put your opponent in a situation where whatever they do, the whistle's going to blow and a penalty is going to be given. In warfare, this means putting your opponent in a position where it looks as if they've done something wrong, even if they have no other choice but to effectively be perceived to have broken the rules. Perception comes out in other areas as well. The paradox of precision. The public, the global public has been convinced about the clinical nature of contemporary warfare. Technology allows us to hit exactly what we want, when we want, with the exact degree of force that we choose to do so. So obviously, when something goes off in a marketplace, killing hundreds of civilians, that's what we meant to do, is it not? It's very, very hard to try and explain that that was not intentional, even if it was completely accidental. And of course, all of this will be exacerbated by fake news, propaganda, and misinformation, of course. Perceptions also feature strongly in chapter 2, which takes us into the world of next generation warfare, which will apparently take place in the shifting context of global power redistribution and new ways of competition. And that competition taking place in new domains, as we've already heard: outer space, cyberspace, and the information space. All of these are now generally incorporated within the standard doctrine of Western military thinking, even if they're not quite sure about all the answers yet. Artificial intelligence and human augmentation may, separately or together, begin to affect the way we understand things like personal responsibility and accountability, a concern I know that the ICRC are grappling with at the moment. Artificial intelligence may offer new ways for us to see through the fog of war, although I would certainly, along with many other people, recommend extreme caution about anything when you're looking at certainty in the realm of conflict. And certainty is something generally to be feared rather than celebrated, as it gives a certain freedom of action that may not always be welcome. While the efforts of the normative environment to keep up with the technological pace of change are constantly playing catch up. Climate change. It's slipped from many people's minds during the last 2 years of COVID, but it is already having a profound effect on population, movement, and therefore conflict. There are clearly security considerations that must be taken into account here, but Hugo warns us that the securitization of this area can also lead, intuitively, if not dangerously, to military responses to things that would not normally have considered to be security or military responses that would have been valid in the past. So the wars of the last 30 years have tended to be, have tended to hurt a certain category of people, as Hugo has already noted. The return to great power military confrontation that we must be ready for now also promises a return to a massive number of combined civilian and military casualties. And with the storm clouds gathering and the use of language such as the protecting our people from genocide to justify military responses on the edge of Europe as we sit here, it suggests that it suggests again what could be at stake right now. So Solferino 21 is a timely reminder that, as ever, we can hope for the best, but Henri Dunant would also probably agree that it's always best to prepare for the worst as well. And just as militaries and state security tools need to adapt to the changing environment to remain relevant, that means that the humanitarian actors in this space have also got to adapt and change to the changing character of war today. Thank you.
We do have a drinks reception when we are finished, but between now and the drinks reception is now your opportunity to get involved in the discussion. I already have a stream of questions from online, but let me start with the audience in the room. So if anyone has any questions for Hugo, please do introduce yourselves, and when I call on you, and I'll ask you. Okay, start with this gentleman, please, go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Federico Rios, and I'm studying master's in diplomacy near doctor. I come from El Salvador, which until a few years ago was regarded as the murder capital of the world. So in our scenario in El Salvador, where we're facing all of domestic violence between gang organizations, what lessons from Solferino 21 do we draw when it comes to effective humanitarian aid when dealing with terrorized groups that are promoting terrorism, but at the same time, when we have to address the root causes of their development, which stems out of war, decades before, and inequalities and poverty and access to education.
Federico, thank you. I think what would Dunant say about Nicaragua and this kind of chronic criminalized political violence? I mean, we've already discussed that there's a possibility to define it as war anyway, actually, and some international lawyers, and I've got one of the very, very best next to me, would have a view on that. But I think in terms of trying to, ease the suffering in those situations, there's no doubt, and the ICRC are already doing this, and so are people like the Mexican Red Cross and many others, that there is a place for neutral humanitarian aid there to do what it does in a war, to cross the lines between gangs and government and other gangs, and to try and use neutral humanitarianism to create a humanitarian improvement in those areas. So that definitely works. But I think also, there's a place for people to organize and decide they don't want that and to pursue non-violent strategies to resist and object to these things. And that's a different tradition to Dunant's tradition, but it is a very legitimate, tradition which can also involve organizing around humanitarian things like clinics and schools, but doing so with a political agenda too, to end chronic violence in society. So I think there are, both ways really, and that's usually a combination of the two is usually how societies resolve conflict eventually.
Hugo, can I take a couple of questions from people who are online? And I'm going to try and group them together. So Beatrice asks you to elaborate further on how locally, or how the local humanitarian should be started and supported internationally. And I want to combine this with a question from Dr. Aziz Hafiz, who is at Humanity First. And he asks how your ideas about the future of humanitarian aid can be transformed into reality when there's so many vested interests at play, from governments, from international organizations, and of course from INGOs that are largely Western-led. So how do we get from here to what you're actually calling for?
Yeah. Well, Hafiz and Beatrice, thank you very much for those questions. And Sorcha raised this point too as well, the how question. How do you deliver on this right to self-determination? And I always feel a bit weak here because I'm really a why person. Why is it the right thing to do? And that's what I argue in the book. How to do it, of course, is very difficult. And that's why I step in and out of practice in academia, probably because I'm not very good at how. But that it's the same in anything. And you're right to talk about vested interests and difficulty. And Sorcha's right to say that maybe some of these elaborations and complications are good complications. We need them, like we need them in the health service and our own social protection systems to find people that really need different things. I think the honest answer is to do what people in the Charter for Change movement are already doing, which is to organize as a group networks of locally led humanitarian organizations who are already working hard. And you need to find those committed people. And if I think of Pakistan, you think of someone like the great Edie Foundation, these extraordinary people who can be humanitarian pioneers in their own societies and build extraordinary institutions and have real effect. And I think it's about investing there and building those networks. I think some networks, like the church networks, a lot of the Muslim networks, and some of the networks set up years ago by people like Oxfam and their partnership schemes, they have an advantage here because they're already working with rooted communities who are the people of that place. And I think that's what we have to try and find and build. And the elephant in the room is always corruption, financial corruption and political corruption, that you politically capture an institution and that you steal from an institution. Those are very real challenges in every society. We've just lost 6.4 billion quid in our UK fund for COVID through theft. So it's going to happen everywhere. And that's why I think it's important to find committed citizens who want to have a vested interest in being citizens of their country and building citizens' organizations. And that was really Dunant's vision. He wanted the National Red Cross, Red Crescent societies to have a vested interest in their own society and be citizen humanitarians. That's about as far as I can go, I'm afraid. But somebody funded me for a couple of years to write how to do localization. I'm sure I would have a jolly good try, but I'm probably not the best person.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, Julia, and then I'll come to Abby. Yeah.
Hello,
Oh, sorry, not Julia.
my name is Cecilia. I'm a DPhil in International Relations here at Oxford. I have a question about the future of humanitarian action, and in particular, we've been there's a lot of debate about the shrinking space for humanitarian action and whether humanitarians should engage with the driver factors of crisis rather than just only with symptoms. And I wanted to know what's your take on this?
Yeah. Are you Cecilia of
Yeah.
the Nexus? Cecilia worked on the Nexus, which is a word I desperately tried to avoid in my book, and I only used it once out of desperation. But anyway, it's a policy area that many of you listening will know about. So, and I've now forgotten your question because I was assuming it was going to be on the Nexus.
She's been trying to engage.
Yes, sort of stretch and limits and things. You know, I think there's different traditions of humanitarians. I think, you know, if we talk about neutral humanitarians like the ICRC and the Red Cross movement, we wouldn't expect them to work on the root causes of conflict. We wouldn't necessarily expect them to try and, you know, engage as a third party in dealing with the conflict. It's not their thing. But, you know, you'll find other traditions of humanitarianism, which will be much more about a sort of liberationist tradition of, you know, helping a society to emerge through a conflict and find justice and peace and a just peace. And they will. So I think, you know, this is why I'm keen to say there isn't just the Swiss model, as I call it, of humanitarianism. There's different ways, and people put different weights on peace, on justice, and on the relief of suffering. And I think, you know, we should accept that different agencies have different approaches. If we want to call some of them humanitarian or different types of humanitarian, that's fine. But I wouldn't expect, you know, if humanitarians are trying to get into the middle of a fight to do certain things, they're not the best people to try and stop that fight at its root causes very often.
Can I just follow up on that? Well, direct you to some questions which are related to the point that's just been asked. So this is a question from Mukesh Kapila, who's asking about whether new humanitarians should speak up more or stay quiet like traditional humanitarians when confronted by atrocities and abuses, and is asking about the neutrality, for example, of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. In fact, the very first question that we got today, and I have just lost it, is a question that also asks about how do we make sense of humanitarian principles today?
I'll take Mukesh's, I think.
Yeah, take Mukesh's,
Yeah,
because I think
that's
it's linked to,
Yeah.
So, you know, to what extent does neutrality continue to play a role?
So, hello, Mukesh. And Mukesh, of course, is a person who has spoken up very bravely in the middle of a genocide and as a humanitarian. And, you know, I think this question of speaking up is often, again, simplified, a bit like the humanitarian question generally. So, you know, you get organizations like the ICRC, and they speak up a lot, but they speak up as per the law rather than as per the perpetrator all the time. So they will be observing very vocally in private and in public very often violations of the law. And so I think it's a simplification to say that humanitarians aren't speaking out. They very often are. But there's also a balancing act. If you want to stay in that place, working with those people, you have to make moral judgments about, is speaking out really going to help them, or is you actually using discretion and the virtue of silence in a situation, is that going to help them better? And are there other people speaking out anyway? So if you speak out and get thrown out, what's the advantage to people? So I think these questions of speaking out must, wherever possible, be negotiated and discussed with the suffering community so that it's understood the moral position an agency is taking or not. And there will be times when you have to speak up and walk away. But on the whole, the humanitarian temperament is to stay, actually, and to find ways of using the law to speak for them in some way.
Let me turn to Adam Roberts.
Well, thank you very much for a really interesting book and timely one. And thanks to Sorcha and David for their very good comments. I've just got a question which I hope isn't too awkward. It's to do with the label humanitarian. I worry being thought of or thinking of others as humanitarians. Is it not simplifying a much more complicated relationship and more complicated, to be frank, set of motives than is implied by that innocent word humanitarian? And in this connection, two more specific questions. One, about the label international humanitarian law, which used to be more commonly known as the law of war. And what do you think of that? Because there is a difficulty there. Many in armed forces find that label a difficult one to cover all that they're doing. And not every rule applicable in warfare can be labeled neatly as humanitarian. And secondly, and this is a question about your experience, which is richer than most people's in this area. Do you find that there are cases where humanitarian workers, however we choose to label them, were operating in particular cases, are reluctant to cite specific provisions of humanitarian law and more generally appeal to some kind of instinctive morality? I remember once meeting in Jerusalem, no less than an ICRC delegate. I asked him how often he had used reference to law in his frequent, almost daily negotiations with the Israeli authorities. And he said almost never. And I'm just curious to know how you see that relationship between humanitarian workers and humanitarian law.
So it's a really interesting question, Adam. Thank you. Well, 4 questions, but it's all about the sort of label of humanitarian. And I think it's a really key point. So I would agree with you that the label humanitarian is covering all sorts of things now. And that's what I mean by, you can be running a school for 30 years in a displaced camp and you're a humanitarian. I mean, and that's not how we would have understood the emergency element of humanitarian, the urgency of it before. So there is a sort of morphing of the word, there's no doubt. And of course, this is a word, humanitarian, that we didn't use when I started. I started in 1983 and we were all relief and development workers. And we tended to go from one. So one moment we were in an emergency, then we'd move off to work in a development project and back and whatever. We incorporated this word humanitarian into the British and American lexicon of what we were doing in the 90s. And, I was one and many of a part of this. We thought that the best way to stay in the middle of conflicts, as Sorcha said, was to adopt the Swiss model. And so we started using this word humanitarian, and all the labels, and David will remember this from Oxfam, the labels changed on the doors from emergency department to humanitarian department. And then we started filling out that ideology with these principles, and we basically converted to the Swiss model. And that's where a lot of the fudge comes from, because in fact, a lot of the British Anglo-Saxon agencies were never just humanitarian agencies. They were also trying to fight for social justice and community development, liberationist agendas, and all sorts of other much wider moral values. So that label has become elasticized and vague, and I'm slightly conscious of pushing back against that 90s incorporation actually at the moment. In terms of the IHL label, I totally agree with you, probably because I've learned at your desk a bit, that the laws of war is a much better phrase. And I'm actually critical in the book of the sort of 1960s onwards when the ICRC and others adopted this amorphous phrase, international humanitarian law, which at one level is misleading, as you say, technically, because you're allowed to kill a lot of people and wound a lot of people and destroy a lot of buildings under international humanitarian law. So Adam's point is absolutely right. I think good old Anglo-Saxon, the laws of war, it's you know what it says on the tin and it's going to be inside the tin. So I prefer that. And I think it's a shame that we took that neutralist, and we also to talk about armed conflict instead of war. It's a sort of neutralism. And it makes out that war is a sort of technical, legal, military issue rather than the tragic issue of human violence and morality. So I would agree with you on that. And the reluctance to cite IHL, I would be slightly sympathetic actually to my former colleagues in the ICRC, because what you find when you go around the world is that not everybody's read those wretched books, and they are big, and complicated. So there's no point. It depends on your audience, the dialect in which you speak. And, if you're talking to Dapo, then the vernacular would be IHL, and you wouldn't stand a chance no matter what you cited, whichever articles and whatever. But if you are talking to armed groups or to ordinary people who have just had their house bombed, you're much more relevant if you talk about what's right and wrong. and how this couldn't have happened, or how it's tragic and terrible and shows a lack of mercy and compassion and all these things. So I agree with you, the language is problematic, but I know this from my own ICIC experience. You can't talk about law all the time. First of all, you go mad, you know. But sorry, Dapo, but you know, I certainly, well, he doesn't. Dapo is one of the rare people who can speak about the law and you'd understand everything he meant. But you need to talk from here sometimes with people about war, not just here. So.
Yeah, Hugo, if I may, I mean, this also feeds very well into the Roots of Restraint project of the ICRC 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
Where the report was finally published, but with the ICRC itself recognizing that it can't just be about law. You can't educate people just about the law. It's got to sit on your ethos, your organizational culture, and that's how you embed those values. You can't simply do it through legal briefs. It's got to be sitting on something. It's got to be sitting on values. It's got to be sitting on what we would call military ethics rather than simply military law.
Well, I think everybody knows about ethics, but not everybody knows about law. So I would agree with you on all those points, except the use of the vernacular, the moral vernacular.
There are many questions online which I've not been able to take, and I know there's some in the room as well. We've actually gone over by about 20 minutes.
I think it's my fault, I'm sorry.
It breaks my heart for us to end on a note that talks about de-emphasizing law. And I would really love to rescue the situation, but we are standing between all of you and the drinks reception that we have outside. It just leaves me to first of all say great and huge thanks to David Whetham and to Sorcha O'Callaghan, who I know is still with us. Thank you very much for those incisive comments on Hugo's book. And of course, to congratulate Hugo on this phenomenal achievement. It's not a slim volume, but it's been a pleasure to read it, actually, and I very much encourage all of you to do so. There was one question on the chat, which I can answer very quickly. It says, can I buy it on Amazon? And I assume the answer is, Hugo.
Yes, you can.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Okay.
Amazon UK at the moment, Amazon America later.
And remember, you can buy it on the publisher's website for a discount with the code Solferino.
Uppercase. Solferino, caps.
All uppercase. Okay, there we go. And thank you very much to all of you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.